Chapter 9, Key Issue 4. Content Objective. Explain why all farmers face sustainability challenges. I-CAN statements. 1. Describe the impact of population growth and trade on farming in developing countries. 2. Identify and explain distinct challenges for developing regions or developing countries to increase food supply. 3. Compare and contrast the role of women in agriculture. 4. Explain the impact of overproduction and market access on farming in developed countries. 5. Explain how von Thunen's model for agriculture location is based on distance transportation from the market. 6. Explain how von Thunen's model applies to state and country scale commercial agriculture. 7. Describe the inaccurate assumptions of von Thunen's model on state and country commercial agriculture. Subsistent farming. Again, reviewing subsistent farms. We're looking at consuming the product on the land or on the farm, so they must feed an increasing growing population in LDCs, and especially a population that's interregionally migrating to urban areas where they can't have farms. Food supply increase has been intensified through production, new farming methods. Fallow fields have been used quicker, so they've had shorter periods of rest, and places like Southeast China have used double cropping, and some regions have used multi-cropping. And we've seen increased GDP with agriculture prices, with exporting to MDCs. Shifting cultivation. Some of the challenges for sustainability we see, it's an extensive area, it burns, it creates pastures, it harms the ecosystem by releasing carbon emissions in the atmosphere, as well as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and then also cutting away of tropical rainforest depletes the biodiversity of animals and plants. It's the most significant long-term environment impact in the tropical regions, and again, after clearing, it can also cause methane released into our atmosphere. Here we look at some intensive farming practices. This is ridge tops or intensive ridge terrace farming in Bhutan. Subsistent farmers, again, they oftentimes have to ship their goods to core countries, so they export instead of directly consuming any surplus. And again, if they're that being said, if they're with the international trade approach, as we learned from development, that they have to again be able to meet the preference of developed regions or other countries of the regions for that global exchange within the international trade approach. Consumers in developed countries pay higher prices for fruits and vegetables that aren't in season. Quickly review what I've covered. I noticed the last question we haven't touched on yet, so don't worry about that one. All right, challenges in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a threat of famine that we saw in the Horn of Africa. They have a natural increase rate of 5. In the Sahel portion of Africa, the land has been overgrazed, where there's already scarce waters. So it's created growth of desertification in the Sahel region in northeast Africa. Again, losing this creates a decline in health and creates a higher propensity of undernourishment. We look at GMO seeds, and GMO seeds are divided. In Africa, they're divided as to whether or not they want to adopt the GMO seeds. The GMO seeds, again, they're the modern biotechnology GMO seeds that oftentimes contain the use of pesticides, herbicides, or fertilizers. Some of the reasons that Africans state as positives, they can have a higher yield value seed, which increases productivity. It can increase nutrition. It can be resistant to pests and droughts, but the negatives are concerned about health problems. It may reduce the effectiveness of antibiotics. Export problems. Europeans are especially strongly opposed to GMOs. They see them as not nutritious or healthy, and they worry about their exports because they're a main exporter of agricultural products to Europe. They also worry about the increased dependence on the U.S. and transnational corporations, the largest producer of GMO crop fertilizer and herbicides and pesticides. I should say not fertilizer, pesticides and herbicides is Monsanto with Roundup Ready weed killer. And they're worried about the terminator gene. So the terminator gene on GMO seeds to prevent farmers from replanting them after a harvest and requiring them to continue to purchase seeds year after year from transnational corporations. And the cost of fertilizers and machineries is very expensive. And the machinery for tilling these large fields is even more expensive than small subsistence fields. And fertilizers will follow petroleum prices and nitrogen prices and phosphorus. We look at traditional agriculture is often divided by gender. Women farmers grow about half the world's population. 80% of women farmers are found in sub-Saharan Africa. A third to half of women labor is found in developing regions within agriculture. Many of these countries are stage 2, so males move to the city for economic reasons, better job, secondary sector job. That increases the workload of women. We look at tying this into GII from our last unit. There's inequality, great inequality in these regions where women are seen as farmers. They cannot access hybrid seeds, HYV seeds. They can't access pesticides, fertilizers. The chemical farming is seen as a male's job, and the women tend to use fertilizers such as animal manure. The women cannot own land. This is found in Asia where there's inheritance laws that gives males rightful land ownership. In the future, for decrease in the GII, again moving towards equality between genders, women need to own land and have to be able to access loans and establish credit, which we saw with some microfinance loans of the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh. All right, and again, we can use this map, or these two maps, to compare the gender within percentage of women working in paid employment, percentage of women working in agriculture. All right, agribusiness we talked about earlier. We'll just brush through it. Remember, it's a multinational corporation that integrates family farms into a more complex structure for food producing. They handle the food processors like Kraft and General Mills handle all the factory work, the seeds, and the marketing and sales. Von Thunen's model was a model produced by Thomas von Thunen. Von Thunen believed that there was concentric rings for commercial farms, and the concentric rings were based on the distance to the market. And the distance to the market was determined by, or the distance to the market would determine the crops that were grown. So the most perishable products were grown in the first ring, that being milk, and then the second ring it would be timber because of the energy needed to heat homes during that time. And the third ring would be crops, more dense crops, and then the fourth would be grazing or higher, more extensive crops. And there are assumptions that the land is uniformed, and also there was social customs to buying preferences of certain goods. All right, here's a look at the 4 rings, the 4 standard rings. And they tie horticulture with dairy. And they have a city which is not a ring to his model. It's just the marketplace. According to von Thunen's model, in the absence of topographical factors, different types of farming are conducted at different distances from the city. Von Thunen recognized that his model would be modified by site factors such as rivers in the sketch to the right, which changes the accessibility of the different land parcels to the market center. So agriculture uses that seek high accessibility locations need to be located near the river. Important access to markets because it will determine profitability and also farming practice. We can take a look at the United States and where it might make sense, where we see dairy, where we have our highest population concentration in the Northeast, and we see ranching, where we have our lowest arithmetic density in the fourth ring. And then we see some highly dense density crops in the third ring. So we can see how it does fit von Thunen's model. But there's also errors because we grow a lot of oranges in Florida. And we grow a third of all our vegetables and fruit in the San Joaquin Valley in California. All right, take a moment to review what you've learned. All right, challenges in developed regions. We look at, again, sustainability challenges. Prime agricultural land is the most fertile land. What's depleting fertile land in the United States is urban sprawl. Farms are being replaced by the growing urban developments. Loss of agricultural land has, in the United States, as seen as 5,000 acres of lost land annually. We look at Maryland with the second largest urban sprawl in the U.S. and they've looked to curb the urban sprawl and also use GPS and GIS to find exact locations for crop production within Maryland so they become more efficient. Desertification is also a huge concern with deforestation, overgrazing, and then agriculture. And then overlogging, we're looking at about 8 to 10% of the world's land is overlogged. And when we look at our waterlogged land, some will say that will be decimations of previous civilizations. All right, here we look at desertification, where it's a threat. We can see it's a threat in western United States and the wheat belt. We can see it's a threat in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southwest Asia, in Central Asia, parts of East Asia, South Asia, in Australia, parts of Brazil, Chile, and parts of Argentina. And then this is a large-scale map of the U.S., and we can see desertification as areas where we see water drought conditions. In California, farmers produce 1/3 of our vegetables and 2/3 of our fruits and nuts, but also California is seeing a diminishing water. They've been severely reduced. In normal years, California, 70% of the water comes from surface water, but after several droughts throughout the last decade, the share has dropped to 40%, creating heightened conditions for desertification. Okay, again, we can see the sustainability challenges within a large producing region in the U.S. This is an example of salinization. Salinization is depleting nutrients in the soil, and it's a result of desertification. It's found in intense commercial agriculture. Here we see extensive grain farms and mixed crop and livestock. The use of chemicals that are sprayed, and then the concern is the runoff with eutrophication. Those chemicals, pesticides, fertilizers, and herbicides that run into our waterways. We look at feedlots and mixed crop livestock. They're They create a lot of runoff in rural areas of animal waste, which creates local pollution, local water supply lines. Cattle can increase carbon dioxide. Also, animal waste can increase nitrogen and potentially dangerous pathogens. And feedlots use a disproportionately large amount of water compared to ranching or other farming practices. Monoculture is another concern for loss of diversity. We can see that in this map in the figure 812 heading below. It says higher current areas with high current genetic diversity of crop variables, loss of crop varieties, commercial agriculture in developed developed regions. We see the U.S. 96% of commercial vegetable varieties listed by the Department of Agriculture in 1903 are not they're extinct. Crop breeders have required genetic diversity to develop new varieties that are resistant to evolving plant pests and disease perils. This need requires the protection of plant stocks and environments in those temperatures in subtropical zones where food plants were first domesticated. And then it goes on to talk about half the livestock breeds that existed in Europe in the 1800s are now already extinct, and almost half the remainder are at risk of or endangered. We can see the endangered regions that are in green. Overproduction of farming. Farming problems in both LDCs and MDCs is profitability, low incomes. They produce more than is demanded. So if demand remains stagnant in stage 4 or 5 countries and they can't ship or export all their crops, then the government will intervene, and the government intervenes in a couple different ways. They can give subsidies, tax breaks to farmers. Subsidies are really especially high in Europe compared to the United States. The United States addresses it through 3 policies. One is farmers are encouraged to avoid crops that have excess supply. 2, government pays farmers when certain commodities are low in price. And the third is the government buys surplus production and sells or donates it to foreign governments. But also, in addition, they'll take that surplus and give it to low-income Americans who receive food stamps. All right, go ahead and take a moment to review what you've learned. And that'll take us to the end of notes.